Hi everyone, my name is Alex Ralphie and welcome to the Express lecture on endocrinology. Here we will master the fundamental concepts of this fascinating field of medicine. Throughout the lecture I will be asking questions which will help reinforce the material just learned and hopefully make the learning process that much more fun. To begin, I'd like to briefly review some general endocrinology concepts. These aren't found in the book, but they are useful in making this section easy to follow. Endocrinology is the study of hormones, the glands that produce them, and the tissues they act on. Hormones are small molecules which alter the metabolism or function of cells by binding to specific receptors on target cells. These receptors can be both located in the cytoplasm or embedded within the cell membrane. Hormones can be secreted into the bloodstream and affect faraway target organs or instead have effects only on neighboring cells. Let's start by reviewing these basic types of hormone signaling. The first type of cell signaling is endocrine signaling. As you can see here, a hormone is produced by a gland and is released into the circulation, and eventually it will bind specific receptors on the target cell or tissue. In this case, we have parathyroid hormone, or PTH, shown produced by the anterior pituitary gland and acting on bone, the small intestine, and the kidney. However, hormones don't necessarily have to be released into the systemic circulation to have their intended effects. Do you recall the other two types of hormone signaling? So hormones can also act in a paracrine fashion, that is, on neighboring cells. An example of this is when the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone to stimulate the anterior pituitary to make FSH and LH. And a third type of signaling is through an autocrine fashion. That is where the hormone acts on the cells by which they were produced. Autocrine signaling is something that we will discuss in your immunology section in relation to T cells and cytokines. So, looking at this diagram, we see how the hypothalamus produces GnRH to stimulate the anterior pituitary to make FSH and LH. These two hormones then go on to exert an effect on the ovaries or testes. What type of signaling is that? Right, endocrine. Another key concept in endocrinology is the idea of feedback. Let's review the hypothalamic pituitary axis, or HPA. This is discussed later in your book under the physiology section, but I feel it is important to have a basic understanding of this before we move on. The CNS controls the release of hypothalamic and anterior pituitary hormones, which then act on target endocrine organs, which also release hormones that have specific effects on particular tissues. For example, the hypothalamus releases CRH, or cortisol-releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. And ACTH acts on the adrenal glands to stimulate the production of which hormones? Correct, glucocorticoids such as cortisol, and sex hormones, but not aldosterone. Another important thing to remember is that the release of hormones by end organs can act as negative feedback regulators on the stimulating hormones. For example, cortisol acts on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus in a negative feedback loop as shown here. This is so that the body will produce only what you need, and when you have enough, you won't make any more. However, as you'll learn in our review of endocrine pathology, there are times when this process goes awry. As you'll also learn about the different individual players in the endocrine system, always think about how each component fits into the larger picture. If you're wondering when we'll be discussing the hypothalamus, refer to the neurology lectures for that discussion. Meanwhile, we are going to move on and discuss endocrine embryology. Let's now get back to the book. We start out with some endocrinology embryology, starting with the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is the first endocrine gland to develop around the 24th day of gestation. The thyroid diverticulum arises from the floor of the primitive pharynx and then descends into the neck. During the migration, it remains connected to the tongue by the thyroglossal duct, which is shown here. Normally, the thyroglossal duct degenerates, and there are only two remnants at the end of normal development. Do you know what they are? The foramen cecum located on the tongue, and the pyramidal lobe of the thyroid gland. These are the normal remnants of the cranial and caudal parts of the thyroglossal duct, respectively. To help you remember the developmental pathway of the thyroid gland, think of this picture, where we start at the foramen cecum here, and imagine a straight line going along the surface of the trachea to reach the area where the pyramidal lobe of the thyroid gland would be here. A common way endocrinology embryology is tested on the boards is by asking what happens when things don't develop normally. For example, a vignette may describe a patient with a neck mass. What is important to focus on is first the location of the mass. If you read that the patient has a midline neck mass, you should be thinking about what structures are found in this general area. And remember, if the thyroglossal duct fails to degenerate, there may be residual tissue in this area. If this tissue persists, it can form a thyroglossal duct cyst. Generally, patients are asymptomatic or the mass is slightly tender, and in most cases, children or adolescents are affected, but it can also occur in adults. A key point to remember is that these masses move with swallowing. However, there is another type of neck mass that is often tested, which, like a thyroglossal duct cyst, is also due to the failure of degeneration of an embryological structure. Do you know what I'm referring to? A branchial cleft cyst. Now, what makes this different from a thyroglossal duct cyst? Well, it is lateral to the neck mass and does not move with swallowing. For bonus points, do you know what it's derived from? A persistent cervical sinus. Remember, boards love to test you on embryology, especially if it's clinically relevant. So here's a great opportunity to make a flashcard or flag this information in your book to be sure to remember it. First Aid has a great list of embryologic derivatives, but to make sure you can test yourself, try to incorporate a clinical question with it, just like we did with the thyroglossal duct cyst, a midline neck mass. Quiz time. Based on your knowledge of the origin of the thyroid, where do you think is the most common site of ectopic thyroid tissue? Lingual thyroid tissue on the tongue. As you step back, I hope you realize how interconnected these concepts are across organ systems. Having a solid understanding of endocrinology will help you significantly on steps 1, 2, and 3, and in clinical practice. Keep up the great work.